Hi, class. The Enlightenment in Europe, what is that all about? The Enlightenment was a cultural flourishing in Europe during the 17th and 18th centuries, spreading of faith in reason and universal rights and laws rather than for faith in the church. And why is this happening? Prior to this time, the Catholic Church ruled a citizen from birth to death, and there began to be some pushback. How did the church rule you from birth to death? Well, there's the baptism of the Catholic Church. They married you in the church. You had to give tithes to the church, and when you died, they gave you your last rites. Correct? So people began to feel oppressed by the church and began to question their motives. Broader developments of the Enlightenment included the expansion of literacy, so that's a good thing, men and women, spread of critical thinking, and the decline of religious persecution. So Enlightenment thinkers sought universal and objective knowledge that would not reflect any particular religion, political view, class, gender, or culture. So that's what the new science is. We're going to look at things objectively. 16th century civil and religious wars, dynastic conflicts, and famine had really motivated the middle-class intellectuals to reason for themselves and to understand and improve their world. So this search for testable knowledge began centuries before the Enlightenment exploded in the European scene. For example, Galileo and Copernicus used calculations and observations to reach conclusions that contradicted age-old assumption. The sun does not revolve around the earth. It was the other way around. There was the emergence of scientific methods. Hypothesis, come up with a hypothesis, experiment the hypothesis, and then you can come up with a conclusion, a legitimate conclusion, thanks to Sir Francis Bacon. Scientists increasingly began to identify natural laws that govern the universe, gravity, things like that, as supported by Newton's Principia Mathematica. So the scientific revolution that a lot of people refer to this time, the Enlightenment, is really a misnomer. It really occurs gradually rather than in one big bang. But monarchs began to get in on it. They began to support scientific efforts. They began to develop royal academies of science, created to show that the crown aristocracy backed science and that great intellectuals backed the monarchy. Time to stop allowing the church to have so much power. The Catholic Church during the Middle Ages was the largest landowner at the time. So this is the Middle Ages, not today. But the Catholic Church during this time was the largest landowner. They were very, very powerful and wealthy. Class, do you know who owns the most land today in the world? Queen Elizabeth II. She owns 6.6 billion acres. Yes, Queen Elizabeth II. Think what if we had lost the American Revolution. England would own all of this our landmass, our home today, wouldn't they? Here's a great painting of Galileo. As you can imagine, the Catholic Church is going to be very worried about this new science, Enlightenment. It's going to undermine Christianity, and they were right. In 1633, the Italian scientist Galileo was put on trial for espousing heretic beliefs, and he was condemned to house arrest. How dare he, dispute what the Catholic Church said, but it ultimately worked out okay for him. Class, Enlightenment thinkers, or philosophes as they were called, applied scientific reasoning to human interaction, and they began to write scathing critiques of flaws in their society. Religious behavior just does not make sense. They had some success in these critiques. For example, Voltaire attacked the torture of criminals. Why are we torturing people? Diderot denounced the despotism of French kings like Louis XIV and Louis XV. And you say you belong to the church, these kings do, but do you act like it? Adam Smith exposed inefficiencies in mercantilism. We talked about that. Greed hurts people, right? and others criticized European conditions in general, imprisonment or exiling people. So the Enlightenment touched all of Europe, but again, the extent of the reach was uneven. It was widely spread in France and England, a little influence on the rulers in Spain and Poland and Portugal, but it flourished in urban and commercial centers like Amsterdam, Edinburgh, and also reached the colonial ports of the New World colonies like Philadelphia and Boston. Rousseau wrote, "Man is born good. It's society that corrupts him." It's going to be the Enlightenment that will influence and inspire American Revolution and later the French Revolution. So what does all this mean? Enlightened thinkers developed new understandings of God. Deism says this: God may have created the universe, but he doesn't really care about our active daily lives. He's not really taking part in human life. So all religion is valid to the extent that they lead to understanding of the natural law. Philosophers were highly critical of the superstitious, dogmatic character of the Catholic Christian faith. This is a painting of a salon. Much of the important work and wit of the Enlightenment was the product of private gatherings known as salons. Often hosted, like the one depicted here, by aristocratic women, these salons also welcomed down-and-out writers, artists, offering everyone, at least in theory, the opportunity to discuss the sciences, the arts, politics, and their fellow humans on an equal basis. So these are very important during the time. Although many Enlightenment thinkers were sponsored by aristocracy, they emphasize merit over birth. For example, John Locke, he says that we are born with the mind of a clean slate, tabula rasa. All ideas acquired through experience and cultural differences result in unequal opportunities. So he really starts this nature versus nurture argument that we still have today. Adam Smith argued that a philosopher and a street porter were born with the ability to reason, and both should be free to rise in society according to their talents. You shouldn't just be born into wealth. However, neither Locke nor Smith believed that women could act as rational and independent individuals. Ouch. So despite protest from educated women, one being Mary Wollstonecraft, the other being Olympia de Gouges, the Enlightenment did little to change the subordinate status of women. Some people look at this time as sort of an early wave of the women's rights movement, and it's just barely there, because women were writing, they were protesting about gender inequalities. For example, Abigail Adams in the colonies started a dialogue during the American Revolution when she wrote to her husband, John Adams, "Remember the ladies," when he was helping write the Declaration of Independence. Did we remember the ladies? Nope, we did not. In England, Mary Wollstonecraft wrote A Vindication of the Rights of Women. This is a very important work. She said women are not naturally inferior to men, and they should have the same educational opportunities. Olympia de Gouges wrote the Declaration of the Rights of Women in response to the Declaration of the Rights of Man during the French Revolution. Unfortunately for Olympia de Gouges, she was beheaded not long after this. And interesting, just a side note, Mary Wollstonecraft's daughter, Mary Shelley, I think was her name, wrote Frankenstein. So I thought that was interesting. There are a lot of other women writers, too, who are criticizing unequal relationship between sexes in marriage, but ultimately they did not make much progress during this time. Class, Europeans are increasingly exploring the world over. They are exploring the Pacific East and the South, modern-day Indonesia in the 18th century. The impact on Australia was profound by their contact, as was in the Americas. It's going to change life for this area. Captain James Cook, he took to the seas, and during his celebrated voyages to the South Pacific, Cook kept meticulous maps and diaries. And although he had little formal education, he became one of the great exemplars of enlightened learning through experience and experiment. By 1788, the British controlled the eastern half of Australia. Listen to this, class. They began exporting criminals to the colony, as well as encouraging free labor migration to the new colony. We need somewhere to send our criminals, so yes, they shipped criminals to Australia. European diseases will wipe out a lot of the indigenous population. The Aborigines of Australia died in great numbers, as did the indigenous people of the Americas, from all of these European imported diseases, or they were forced to flee from their ancestral populated areas. So what we'll find in this time is that the British colonists planned and put in place a grand-scale conquest and resettlement of Australia. Cook went on 2 or 3 different voyages. He brought European plants and animals into Australia with massive ecological consequences. They began importing sheep into Australia to allow for a wool growing economy. And by 1788, British colonized Australia again in order to establish a prison colony, to exploit Australia for their resources like timber and flax, and really began to use this as a strategic base against Dutch and French expansion. So there began to be competition between the European states that will play out over time. By the 1860s, class, there were 1.2 million Anglo-Australians. European ideas and institutions were very influential and more disruptive in Oceania than even in Afro-Eurasia. So, for example, European exploration and colonization in the new areas of the Pacific came at a time when Europeans were using race to categorize the other people that they encountered. This is an engraving from Cook's voyage around the world. Kangaroos were unknown in the West until Cook and his colleagues encountered and ate them on their first visit to Australia. This engraving of the animal, which unlike most animals, plants, and features, it actually kept the name that the Aborigines had given it, the kangaroo. So from Cook's 1773 travelogue, they depict the kangaroo's environs and even emotions. Kangaroos have emotions. And this is Omar, the South Sea Islander brought to England by Captain Cook, and he was the object of much curiosity in London in the 1780s. And that typically tended to be what the Europeans would do when they would find a new area to conquer, imperialize, colonize. They would bring some of the native islanders or native indigenous people back to Europe to, show the people what they encountered. So class, for this period of time, 1500 to 1700, we talked about this new wealth is going to come pouring in from all of these conquests, and it's going to allow a global cultural enlightenment, if you will. Experiments in religious toleration encourage cultural exchange. So like with the Muslim dynasties, they're allowing other religions to live in their conquered territories. One other thing that's going to take place, class, that I think is interesting is book production is going to soar. People all over, we're becoming more educated, we're reading more, we're sharing ideas and thoughts. Again, we're still hunting those luxury goods. We still want China has, we still want what other regions have. And I mentioned some of those to you. And while the Islamic and the Chinese worlds are going to really retain their own systems and turn inward, the Americas and the Oceania regions are going to face European cultural pressure and conquest. African cultures, which we didn't have time to talk about, is going to largely escape this influence. They're going to feel the impact of European expansionism due to slave trade, but class, it's going to be the 1800s before any Europeans go inland of Africa. The world is more integrated than ever before. Class, as usual, keep in touch.